Okay. This is our last chapter for the unit. Water, electrolyte, and acid-base balance. Balance in this context means that what goes in is equal in amount to what comes out, so that you have the same amount of water, sodium, etc. in your body, even though you're constantly adding and subtracting some. The areas in the body where water is found are called the fluid compartments. The major compartments are intracellular, inside the cells, and extracellular, outside the cells. Intracellular makes up almost 2/3, 63% of the water in your body. Extracellular, all the fluid outside your cells, is the remaining 37%. Out of the extracellular fluid, most of that is interstitial fluid, meaning it's within the tissues. It's not held within vessels or a specific space. Then the majority of the remaining 25% is the plasma. So other fluids like lymph and cerebrospinal fluid are very small portions. Now, you've probably heard something saying what percent of your weight is water. Somebody give me a number. 50, 80, 60,
75.
75. The 50 has it. Okay. So for women, it's on average 50% of our weight. For men, it's 60%. Children will be a little higher. A newborn might have as much as 65%. The sex difference is based on tissue distribution, where men on average have more muscle, which has a lot of water. Women on average have more fat, and fat repels water, so there's not that much water in adipose tissue compared to other tissues. And the numbers decrease with age. So a 20-year-old in here would have a higher percent of their weight from water as a 40-year-old of the same sex who would have more water than a 60-year-old. Fluid moves between compartments by forces that probably look familiar by now, at least I hope they do: hydrostatic pressure and osmotic pressure. So we have blood pressure pushing the fluid against the walls. That pushes fluid out of the capillaries, so out of plasma and into interstitial fluid. And then hydrostatic pressure in the tissues pushes interstitial fluid into the lymph. Osmotic pressure can also affect those movements, but it's especially important in fluid going between intracellular and extracellular compartments, because that always requires crossing a cell membrane. The water will move based on concentration gradients. Our first section looks at water balance, where your water intake comes from, how you lose water, and how we regulate it. The majority of your water intake is from drinks. That's 60% of the total. Another 30% is water found in your foods. Pretty much all foods are going to have some water in them, even beef jerky and saltines. But wetter foods like soup and fruits will have a larger percent of water. And meats if they're not cooked to a point where they're drier. We also create about 10% of our daily water intake. We call that metabolic water because it's created through metabolic processes or chemical reactions. The major one is cellular respiration. Does somebody remember what molecule we need to put in to get the most ATP?
Oxygen.
Oxygen. And what does the oxygen turn into? It's actually the fuels that turn into carbon dioxide. Yep, the oxygen gets extra electrons and attracts the hydrogen ions. It turns into water. So the oxygen we're breathing in is getting turned into water, about 10% of our intake per day, which would be about coffee. There are some other processes that produce water, like dehydration synthesis when you build proteins. But then if you break apart those proteins, you get the water back. So that one's more of a little more balanced. The cellular respiration we just keep doing in one direction. Water output, the largest method is through urine, which is also about 60%. So that's why we said our average urine volume is about 1.8 liters per day, and they tell you to drink about 2 quarts of water, which is close to 1.8 liters. The drinks and the urine are equal, and then the others take up the rest. Evaporation from skin and lungs is the next largest portion. This is the water just comes out of you. Our skin has a couple of layers of protection to prevent that. Somebody tell me the protein that's in our skin? Keratin. And then what else do we secrete? Oils. It's called sebum. Yeah. Okay. So both of those help hold the water in, but they're not 100% effective. So some evaporates from our skin. And then our lungs, we let the water get in there to moisturize it, to keep the alveoli from drying out. But then we exhale that water. So that's the next largest portion of water loss. Feces makes up about 6%. Sweat is typically 6%, but this is the one where it's most variable. Now, on a hot day, you're going to sweat a lot more, lose a lot more water, and that's when you need to drink more to balance it out. So, any questions on water intake and output? Regulation. We'll lay this out like homeostasis, because it is. The stimulus is actually the concentration of the ECF. So there's not really a way for our bodies to measure the actual amount of water because it's so spread out. So our hypothalamus with osmoreceptors estimates based on concentration. If it's more concentrated, the assumption is, well, that's the normal amount of solutes, but we've lost some of the water. Or if it's more dilute, we must have taken in too much water and diluted our fluids. Then the hypothalamus is also the control center. The effectors we have the kidneys which change the amount of water that's excreted. So if our fluid is too concentrated, they'll retain water to try to dilute it back out to where it should be. If it's too dilute, they'll excrete more. And the ADH is how the message gets to the kidney. Okay? So the hypothalamus makes the ADH, but who secretes it? Posterior pituitary, yeah. Another effector is actually the cerebrum. The hypothalamus tells it, we don't have enough water. The kidneys can't make more water. All they can do is hold on to what we have. So therefore, you have to go actively get some more water. So the hypothalamus makes us feel thirsty. If we had extra water, then it would make us not thirsty. Questions on this loop? There are some disorders with water balance. Dehydration is well known. Typically comes from excess sweating, diarrhea and vomiting, where you lose fluids from the digestive tract, or just from not drinking enough. This is usually mild. It can also come from diuretic drugs that are meant to decrease blood pressure by decreasing blood volume, but sometimes the dose is too high, or somebody doesn't like how much they have to go to the bathroom, so they drink less water, and they get dehydrated. So initially, the extracellular fluid is where the water is lost from. It becomes more concentrated. So that pulls water out of the cells to balance out the concentration. And so then your cells have become dehydrated. So, to treat dehydration, you need to replace the lost fluids, and often some salt is lost as well, so you don't want to just replace the water. On the other end, water intoxication. Too much water dilutes the body fluids. So it's not the volume that's the problem, but hyponatremia, which means low blood sodium. That will affect the functioning of every cell that needs to use the concentration gradients between itself and the extracellular fluid, so neurons, muscles, even the heart. Water intoxication is most common with endurance events like marathons, where everybody knows you need to drink plenty of liquid when you're sweating like that to make sure you don't get dehydrated, but people will often overdo it, and you lose salt with the sweat as well. If you're drinking just water, you're going to imbalance your electrolytes. And according to the textbook, even most sports drinks don't replace the salts at the levels needed for a long-term event like that. So what's recommended there is that people actually estimate how much water they're going to lose based on their weight and activity level, and only drink that much. What's shown here is the excess dilute extracellular fluid. That water moves into the cells, and then they become swollen and more dilute. The last one is based on not the amount of fluid, but the location, and that is edema. This is excess interstitial fluid. Usually it's localized. Sometimes it can be all over. Often it's in the legs just due to gravity pulling the fluids downward. Makes it harder to bring them back. Potential causes of edema include low levels of plasma proteins, because that decreases the osmotic pressure. This can happen with liver dysfunction because the liver makes those proteins, and it can happen with protein deficiency. One of the nutritional disorders in chapter 18, kwashiorkor, is when the children with protein deficiency, their belly is swollen because that's basically edema and it collects in the peritoneal cavity. Poor flow in veins or lymphatic vessels would mean that the fluid's not getting brought back to the heart as it should be, and it just collects in the tissues. And then inflammation is a localized edema that's usually supposed to be temporary, just until you fight off the infection and heal the damage. Questions on water balance disorder?